and welcome to the Sentient Media podcast, where we meet the people who are changing the way we think about and interact with the world around us. And today our guest is Kenny Torrella, a staff writer at Vox. This is at Vox, he writes about farmed animal welfare, the meat industry, and plant-based and cellular agriculture sectors. But before he was there, he was Vice President of Public Engagement at Mercy for Animals, and he also held several other roles in nonprofits like the Humane Society of the US. But Kenny's work has helped to bring stories about factory farming and other issues that we tend to ignore to the front of the conversation. And Kenny, I find what you've achieved at Vox so incredibly inspiring, and I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me, Anna. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. And I mentioned in the intro there that your background was actually in nonprofits and animal protection groups. So I'm curious, what was your journey into journalism?
Yeah, that's right. So I first got involved in animal welfare issues back around 2005 when I started learning more about the food system. And I'd always cared a lot about animals. I think like a lot of people, I grew up with pets. I spent, my whole childhood in the woods and forests near my house, and got a real appreciation for wildlife. And so that eventually steered me into working at animal welfare nonprofits. And in the first 5 years of my career, I focused more on policy. So I worked to oppose Ag-Gag legislation, the legislation some of your listeners might be familiar with that restricts or entirely eliminates the ability for animal welfare groups, for journalists to investigate factory farms. I also worked on legislation to ban cages and crates for farmed animals, so cage-free egg campaigns, crate-free pork campaigns in the United States. That was at the state level. And then I transitioned into communications. I had always had a real love for writing. I could never really do well past beyond, a C letter grade in science or math when I was in school, but I loved English, loved history. And so over the last 5 years the last 5 years before coming to Vox, I just started doing more opinion writing and then also some reported writing around animal agriculture. And then when the job came up at Vox, it felt like the perfect fit. And it's been really great to be here for the last year and a half.
And you started at Vox as the deputy editor, right? And then you transitioned into staff writing.
That's right.
And why was that? Was it just you just wanted to write more?
Yeah, I wanted to write more. And admittedly, I also just felt I was a stronger writer than editor. A lot of people who become editors, they're writers first. That's like the typical pathway. And so I felt like I just needed more writing under my belt and also just enjoyed more writing than editing.
I mean, so on this podcast, and obviously the work that we do at Sentient Media, we speak to a lot of journalists, we interact with a lot of different writers. And most recently we had Jessica Scott-Reed and Jenny Splitter chatting about at length how difficult it is to get stories about animals in mainstream media. You've managed to kind of land on this situation within Vox where it's almost like you have permission to write about like anything to do with animals that from the outside, it looks like you kind of have free reign to like write about all these issues that a lot of writers find it so difficult to get placed. Like, what's the reality actually? Is that what it's like?
Yeah, that's kind of what it's like. I mean, I think most of the articles that I write start with just an idea I have, and then I'll shape it with an editor. And so I think, at Vox, we have a lot of freedom to cover the issues that we find the most important and also the most neglected. I try to write things that you might not see at another outlet, which is why I don't write a lot of like breaking news or news of the day kind of stories. But yeah, I feel like I have way more ideas than I have time to write. So I'm really fortunate and just really thankful that I do have a lot of autonomy in what stories I pursue. And I think it helps that I am also just on the same wavelength as my editors. We both have this orientation of wanting to cover animal stories that we find to be really important, but you might not see elsewhere.
That's really interesting. And I wonder, when before you were working at Vox, were you pitching? Yeah, I've seen you've had articles in other outlets as well as an independent writer, not just within, working for the other nonprofits. Like, did you find it difficult to get those stories with that narrative placed in those other outlets before you were at Vox?
Yeah, it was certainly challenging, and I think I had the same experience as Jess and Jenny and other writers. They've both contributed to Vox, and I loved working with them. I helped edit their stories, and yeah, so I did find difficulty when I was working at Mercy for Animals, doing communications and pitching news outlets on animal stories, whether I was a writer or if it was something Mercy for Animals was doing. It's an uphill battle because a lot of news outlets aren't going to prioritize animal agriculture. It's not top of mind for a lot of readers. However, a lot of people do really like reading these stories because I think if they can get over that hump of reading about the horrors of animal agriculture, it is interesting because almost everyone eats animal products, and people do, I think, have an interest in where their food comes from, what happens along the supply chain, not only what happens to animals, but the environment, farmers, meatpacking workers. There's so many different angles to take. And so I think there are stories that can appeal to a wide array of writers, or sorry, a wide array of readers. But it can be hard to get it picked up because editors are short on time. Outlets have been shrinking over time. A lot of outlets have just gone under. So it's more competitive than ever and more difficult to get stories placed than ever, I would imagine.
Yeah. And one of the things that Jess and I actually spoke about recently was about this idea that actually when you're pitching an editor, as you say, most people do consume animal products. So when you're pitching editors who are consuming animal products, maybe they're reading your pitch whilst they're having their, egg or bacon, bagel. It kind of forces this acknowledgement of the meat and dairy industry, whilst you as an individual might want to deny it or not think about it. So I was wondering if there's that, like, is there something at play there that editors are like, oh, I don't want to really think about this right now? Do you think that's fair, or is that kind of like a bit?
I can't speak for certain. I can't get in the minds of editors and how they feel about that. I think that's also just a natural tendency. Like, I think one fault that a lot of vegans can make is maybe that they're like, because they're vegan, they're maybe not hurting animals or people in other ways with their actions or with their beliefs or what kind of policies they support. And it's easy to push that out of your mind. And I think editors, writers, the general public, we're kind of all, guilty of that to some degree. But I also think a good editor is one who's very open-minded and is open to receiving pitches and publishing stories that counter, their beliefs, their opinions, as long as like it's an interesting, compelling, engaging story. Then I think for good editor, that's all that really matters. But it's also it's a topic, animal agriculture and the issues that arise from it. It's a topic that is hard to come up with fresh angles on, because a lot of times it's like, bad thing number 598 about this industry that maybe someone hasn't heard about. And so it's kind of incumbent upon the writer and the editor to be creative, to come up with fresh angles, to try to really try to untangle what's happening and what can be done about it.
So it's a really
very,
good,
very hard.
Yeah, really, really hard, and you're absolutely right. On that note, something I do like to ask as many people as I interact with, what was the last story that you saw in mainstream media that was about, ideally about farmed animals, something obviously not written by you or published by Vox, but outside of that community? Like, what was the last piece that you saw?
Well, yeah, not a lot of this coverage, like you said, like centers on animals. It might center on ag and farming, but not really center the animals. One article that I thought was really interesting and came from a surprising outlet was the Financial Times did an article a few weeks ago. I think it was like late May about pigs, and they even did like a photo shoot of these rescued pigs, and it was essentially just looking at the like social and emotional and intelligence of pigs. I thought that was really compelling, and also again an interesting source, because usually when the Financial Times looks at these issues, they look at the what movement in this space means to investors or to companies, but not to animals themselves.
Yeah, I absolutely love that piece. And I spoke to Henry Mance at Spy. I spoke to him after it was published, and I just said, what he did there was center the pig as like the hero character. And I was like, you have given us permission to do that, because like you just said, Kenny, like we always try and find these different angles, these different ways in to tell these stories about these animals, but who is at the center of this story should be these individual creatures, these individual heroes who have been on a journey like that. And I told him that like by getting that story published, like he really kind of gave us a little push in the direction of like, hey, if the FT is going to publish a story like this, then maybe actually censoring animals as the main character isn't such a bad idea. Maybe we can start to do a little bit more of that. And he did bring in the financial aspect with all of the with the shareholder issues within McDonald's. And yeah, it was just an awesome piece. So I'm glad that you picked that, and I thought it was such a standout story of like we just don't see that, and especially not from the Financial Times. And he said it was well received from the community, so that's really cool. And he's been asked if he might be doing further ones in the future. So yeah, it's really cool. But like you say, we don't often see that kind of thing. Often like animals are like the byproduct of the story. And I don't know if you're aware of our monthly recap. Like every month we do a review. Yeah. And Jasmine Lever somehow manages to narrate the stories in 60 seconds. I don't know how she does it. It's amazing. But in May, my list was like enormous. I had 9 pages of links to review. And it was excessive. And I actually we decided to give Henry's piece in the FT like the the award of the month, because it was such a standout piece. But I was wondering, like, we've been doing this for the last like 6 months, this kind of media recap, and I have noticed like an increase in stories since I first started at Sentient Media like 2 years ago. I mean, you've been doing this for a lot longer than I have. Have you noticed like an uptick, at least in us having these conversations in the media?
I have, and I think it's kind of gone in waves and depends what's happening in these spaces. So I think, when I started following these issues in the early 2000s, there was very little coverage. And when there was coverage, it was usually focused on the business market aspect, and very little focus on, well, who might be harmed by factory farming. There was very little attention on workers, animals, contract farmers, pollution, climate change. But I've seen that change a lot in the last 5-10 years. And I kind of think of it happened in 2 waves. And I actually think the wave of ag-gag bills that kind of swept through the country in the early 2010s, I think generated a lot of interest. And actually Temple Grandin called it, I might misquote her, but I think she said it was like this, I think it was her who said this, the stupidest thing that the ag industry ever did, because it attracted a lot of attention, because a lot of journalists and readers were thinking, well, why is the ag industry lobbying for bills that would make it illegal for animal welfare groups or journalists to investigate them? What exactly are they hiding? And so I think journalists really picked up on that and did a lot of stories around ag-gag for about 5 years straight. Excuse me. And then I think a lot of stories kind of branched out from that. And then around 2015, 2016, when Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods started coming onto the scene, we've also seen this huge wave of focus on the plant-based sector, the cell-cultured meat sector, and I think both of those like waves of media coverage help to expand the media's understanding of animal agriculture and just do a lot more reporting on it. not just from the business side, not just from the farming side, but maybe a more holistic view of the issues in our food system.
Do you find that you're comfortable writing about ag-gag laws, or do you obviously you've written about them a lot in the past, it's a kind of silly question, but do you find it sometimes when we cover issues within spaces like Iowa, for example, which is so rife with ag-gag laws, when we tell these stories or when we do something that's breaking the ag-gag laws, we end up causing the law to come down even harder on protesters, on journalists, and on activists. Do you see there being a danger in covering ag-gag laws, or do you think it's your kind of duty as a journalist to uncover this stuff?
I mean, I think it's cliche, but sunlight is the best disinfectant. I believe in that, and I think sometimes activists worry, well, if you put too much attention on something, it will create a backlash effect, and that that could be true. But I think what sparked these ag-gag laws were the wave of undercover investigations that took place from the early 2000s into the early 2010s. I think that was the main reason. But yeah, I don't know if there's a correlation between critical coverage of animal ag and new ag-gag bills and bills being passed. I don't know, but I don't think that should discourage anyone from reporting on the issues.
That just proves that there's something that they're hiding, to your point.
Right. And several of the ag-gag bills, laws have been overturned. And so I think a lot of this ag-gag legislation was inevitable with all of the investigations that took place and all of the terrible coverage that it led to. But of course, I'm sure some activists might feel conflicted if their actions resulted in another harmful law. But yeah, I don't think I have the final answer on that, but it's interesting to think about.
For sure. So thinking if we have seen a bit of an uptick, or if we have seen more interest in coverage of this kind of content over the last 20 odd years, but what do you think the journalism and reporting space looks like in the next, say, 5 years?
The next 5 years, if I had to predict, which is something we do at Future Perfect, sometimes we try to predict what might happen in the next year. It's like a fun exercise we do at the beginning and end of each year. But I think what we're going to see is maybe more nuanced and refined coverage of these issues. I think the last 10 years, a lot of media coverage around animal agriculture and the plant-based food sector was pretty straightforward and basic and kind of like a 101 understanding of these issues. But I think moving forward, we're going to see more nuanced, ideas in the discourse. And we're already seeing that over the last few years. And a lot of that, I think, is thanks to outlets like The Guardian, like Vox and The Intercept and New Republic and plenty of others who are just putting out more stories on these issues. And the more coverage there is, the more space there is to not just say the same thing over and over again, but try to bring fresh perspectives or dive into more of a niche, whether it's a niche in animal welfare or water and air pollution or climate change or the effect it's had on meatpacking workers. I should say, I'll go back and edit my previous answer that I think after the wave of coverage around ag-gag, then the wave of coverage around plant-based, during COVID, we've seen a huge uptick in coverage around how meatpacking workers are treated, how they were treated during the COVID pandemic is certainly not very different from how they were treated well before, but I think it shined a spotlight on it and created some momentum on that issue. That hasn't resulted in policy that protects them quite yet, but that has kind of served as another wave, another national story. But yeah, that's how I see the next 5 years possibly playing out. I don't know. Media is constantly evolving and changing, and but I think we're going to see more and more like nuanced and refined coverage of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were listing all those amazing outlets, you of course forgot Sentient Media.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course, Sentient Media.
But no, we're doing a focus, a closer look week. Every month we do a closer look at a particular area within animal agriculture, and in July we're doing meat packing, and I'm actually speaking to Pete Paxton, the undercover investigator who's been doing this for since the early 2000s as well. So it's going to be super interesting to get his take. I mean, that's, ties in with exactly what you were saying. Like, we're going to hear from undercover investigators in the meatpacking space and the individual workers themselves, the conditions that they're working within. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? You can't imagine what happens in these spaces without speaking to somebody who's been there. But you mentioned Future Perfect, which is obviously one of the biggest things that everybody's heard about at Vox, and it's an awesome title. It's a great it's a very direct, very clear, very evocative image that you create there. I was wondering, you say you do it for a year, this planning, but what does a perfect future look like to you?
I think the word perfect is loaded. I think we're not going to achieve some utopian food system so long as there are so many corporate interests involved in our food system. But I think one that is way less reliant on animals would certainly greatly improve it, not only for the animals but also reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the effects of pollution from ag and growing feed crops on water and air. Obviously, we've talked about the issues in the meatpacking system, the contract farmer system. So I think I would say maybe not a perfect food system, but a better one would be one that's way less reliant on animals. I also think I want to be mindful too. There's a lot of discussion right now around like silver bullet solutions, and I think would a food system that is way more plant-based be better? In many ways, certainly. Is it going to fix all the problems? Far from it. I think one thing that I've been thinking about more lately is just that I think the plant-based movement could probably be doing a lot more work around what's actually wrong in plant production. There's so much focus on what is wrong with animal farming, and the solution is always proposed in plants. It's in the name: plant-based diet, plant-based food system. But again, like we've talked about it a little bit, there's so much cruelty in the production of fruits and vegetables on farm workers, and pollution from fertilizers and pesticides that both affect farm workers and waterways. And so I think I don't think there's like one simple answer that a food system that uses a lot less animals is perfect. I think it's certainly better, and it's an approach that hits lots of issues: workers, animals, the environment. And so much research has come out showing that a plant-rich diet would have the #1 impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But I think if we're going to have a more humane food system, we also need to focus on the people in the food system, and especially how people are treated to bring plants to our plates.
Yeah, so it's a really good point. And on the idea of thinking about the future and perfection, you recently wrote about, well, I don't know if it was recent, it was a couple of months ago, but you wrote about the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, and his imperfect vegan. And that's like quite a good example of what you're talking about there, like this shift to plant-based, but perhaps not like this idea of being a perfect vegan. Could you fill us in a little bit on that story? And I think you called it was Fishgate, right?
Yeah, a few months ago, it came out that Mayor Eric Adams of New York City, while he's referred to himself as plant-based, maybe occasionally he's called himself vegan, I'm not quite sure. It came out that I think through maybe some restaurant workers that he occasionally eats fish. And of course, it was a scandal because if someone calls themselves vegan or plant-based, but they occasionally eat fish, well, then are they diluting the meaning of vegan or plant-based? And obviously there's the big question that a lot of people in the media asked, well, then what else are you telling, white lies about, or maybe harmful lies about if you're not being totally truthful about how you eat? But I think it was also an opportunity, a lot of people, there's a lot of like Schadenfreude around that, of people pointing their fingers at Eric Adams and saying he's a hypocrite. And it's not just him. That happens like whenever a celebrity has called themselves vegan for a while, and then they either go back to eating a standard American diet or they become a flexitarian. People inject a lot of negativity into that conversation. And I think it's really harmful, because I think pushing veganism as the only solution is, futile, because most people don't want to go fully vegan, at least at this point in time. And maybe that'll change, maybe it won't. But I think it's really harmful when we set up really any like moral or ethical dilemmas as binary, as either you're vegan, or if you occasionally eat animal products, you're, I don't know, betraying the identity or label wholesale. When, most people's lives and decisions that they make are in a gray zone. They're not 100% one way or the other. And I think, making a big to-do out of someone who's mostly vegan but occasionally doesn't eat vegan food is harmful, and also affects how we think about other issues. It's like you're either in or out, or all or nothing.
Yeah, it's super true. That was like literally going to be my next point, was this idea that every single time a celebrity slips up, when Miley slipped up, and everybody just jumps on her. And it's not just like the vegan community that jumps on her, but like the meat eaters and people who don't label themselves as plant-based or as vegan get very excited, because they're like, yes, we're validated. You see, they're not actually vegan. And it's like this, it's damaging, and it's kind of stressful to watch it play out, where you're like, this person, sure, they've done something different with their diet that isn't what you wanted, or it is what and it gets to this point where you're like, well, yeah, you don't really know what to do with that information anymore. It's like, it's intense. I think we kind of revel in this idea of somebody failing in a way.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's kind of an outgrowth of social media. Like, I don't remember, I don't know, when I was a kid, I wasn't paying attention to celebrity discourse or paying all that much attention to the news, but I don't remember popular culture being like that, 20 years ago. It seems there's just a lot more almost like glee in people failing or messing up. Of course, I think when people mess up or fail in a way that hurts other people, it's understandable why people might get pretty upset, or find some kind of enjoyment in teasing them. I don't think that's healthy, but I understand it. But when people aren't perfect and still want to point their fingers at them, I think it's really toxic.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to this idea that a lot of people who call themselves vegan present in this kind of morally superior way, where it's like, well, if you're making out like you're perfect and that you're superior to me because I eat meat or eggs or dairy, whatever, then if you slip up and I can figure out that you have a pair of leather shoes, from cow leather or whatever, then I'm going to run with that, because you're not better than me, therefore.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of people misunderstand about maybe the average vegan or vegetarian, is that while there's certainly like a vocal minority that is very focused on both, the purity of their own diets or their own lifestyles and those of others, I think the average vegan or vegetarian I know is not so concerned with what other people are doing, or is not so concerned with the perfection of their own choices. I think a lot of people are more pragmatic and think about harm reduction rather than harm elimination.
Yeah, that's my experience as well, but not if you look on Twitter, I guess. Would
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
that vocal minority. Yeah.
yeah. um so yeah, I guess like this kind of brings me onto one of your more recent articles. The title is "The Plant-Based Future of Food Doesn't Always Taste Great," and even just reading, the headline, it really resonated with me, because I feel like if people do want to reduce, or if they do want to try plant-based products, and if they're rubbish, then it's really annoying. Like, I always say to my like friends or family, if we're out, I'm like, I'll buy you dinner, as long as it's plant-based. And when it comes and it's, you know, tastes like crap, it's really devastating, because it's like you put all of this you put all of this hope and belief into this idea that if this person who's trying to reduce tastes something that, that's vegan, that tastes great, then they're going to be more likely to take that option next time. But if they don't, then if it tastes like crap, then they are like, well, I'm not going to try the plant-based option again because it tastes rubbish. And I feel like there's this it's even more important that when something identifies as vegan or plant-based, that it tastes really good,
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a big problem in the plant-based food industry is that a lot of startups are rushing to market with products that aren't quite ready. Um, I also think there's been so much hype, so much hype that it's kind of impossible to live up to that hype. And so inevitably some people are going to be disappointed. I also think it's kind of a realization, and maybe there's time for the plant-based movement to step back and say, and I don't really know a solution for this, or what I'm going to say is kind of vague, but I think there is much of a focus on how can we replicate one for one certain animal products, and I think that's really important. But there's not then that much discussion around, well, then what do you do with those animal products? Like at the end of the day, just like hot dogs and burgers and chicken nuggets, like they can taste good, but they're kind of boring. How can you use those products to make really delicious food that is not that's not the way they're traditionally used? I mean, like most of the food I eat is, South Asian food or Thai food, or like, I live in the DC area where Ethiopian food is everywhere, and it's, very vegetarian, vegan friendly. And so I think there needs to be kind of like a next step in, well, okay, here are these products. A lot of them do taste really good, but how do we, I think the startups, it would be smart for them to think about like, how can we educate consumers to use them in more exciting and interesting and flavorful applications?
Mm. I mean, yeah, like I feel like if we can show people more recipes, and like you say, Ethiopian food tends to be vegetarian anyway and doesn't include any of the kind of fake meat products,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, why can't we just, vegetables taste good. I saw recently in the UK, in Wales, they're talking about introducing insect like crickets to primary school meals, so for younger children, as a way to boost protein. And you're like, well, have you heard of lentils? Because how is it going to be easier to convince a kid to eat an insect than to eat lentils? Like, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually my mother-in-law used to work in education and ran a small school, and she said that actually a lot of the younger kids in her schools um, were just kind of naturally drawn towards like vegetables and legumes, and it wasn't until kind of later in maybe their primary or secondary years that they focused more on meat and dairy and eggs. So I think that's kind of one of the challenges, is that I think a lot of people kind of perceive vegetarian or vegan food as salads, as greens, and like whole grains and dried lentils, and that's it. But I think there's a lot of really creative chefs and entrepreneurs out there who are kind of pushing the boundaries, and kind of showing what people can do with vegan food. I mean, Brian Terry, his cookbooks are great. The Korean vegan on social media, she's amazing. So I think in some ways, as we talked about some of the downsides of social media, it's also been interesting to see what like really creative vegan chefs have been able to show the world that what can be done to make plant-based food more, tasty and go beyond what people's perceptions might be of them.
Yeah, for sure. And we've definitely seen more research emerging that news articles and social media have a really big impact on the way people eat. And more data is coming out to support that notion that I think we probably feel instinctively, but now we have the numbers to back it up, which is really exciting if you're in the space that we're in. But I think one of the other issues as well, which you've written about, is the meat paradox. So you covered that in your story, in your article, Why We Love Animals and Love to Eat Them. And I feel like this kind of that has to be at the heart of all these debates about food, this cognitive dissonance that we all have. I mean, everybody has it around something. You've already said that, but and it doesn't apply to just eating meat. But could you explain what the meat paradox is, and do you think there are any solutions or ways we can work better to resolve it?
Yeah. So the meat paradox is a term that was coined, I think, in like the early 2010s by some Australian researchers. And Rob Percival, who's not a vegan himself, wrote a book called The Meat Paradox that came out a few months ago. And I interviewed him and talked to him about his book. And it's really interesting. And essentially, the meat paradox is defined as like that tension that people feel between loving animals, but also enjoying eating them. And that creates cognitive dissonance that can like come up in many ways. It can look like guilt and sadness. It can also look like kind of like hating vegans and vegetarians. And I think the meat paradox also kind of strengthens the divide in the culture war, that it's like either you're vegan or you're not, rather than staking out a middle ground, which is what Rob Percival is really all about. And he certainly, he himself says, I eat much less meat than the, typical person in a high income country. But, I'm not a bleeding heart vegan either. And when it comes to kind of trying to resolve the meat paradox, clearly, no one has the answers yet on how to do that. I think that, one thing that Rob really brought up is trying to like diffuse these culture war debates. And that's going to be tough. I mean, we're seeing just in the US, some people in the Republican Party are starting to use meat as more of a symbol of the culture war, of a symbol of American identity, because we eat more meat than pretty much any other country in the world, about 225 pounds per person every year. And so resolving it is, very hard. I think there's some groups that are doing interesting work on this. I think maybe some ways to resolve it, or at least as a first step, trying to reduce the suffering of animals in the food system rather than, saying let's eliminate them. And so there's a lot of groups, working to ban cages or crates or certain practices that are kind of some of the hallmarks of factory farming. There are some groups like Default Veg that are doing really interesting work by, rather than going to, college cafeterias or corporate cafeterias and saying, remove all your animal products. The approach that they're taking is making vegetarian and vegan foods more of the default. So maybe they're the first 3 items in a line of 5 items, or dishes, like in a cafeteria setting, rather than having 1 veg option and 4 meat-based options. Flip it, and so you still have the meat option for people who really want it, but you're encouraging more plant-based eating. And yeah, Default Veg, they've collated a lot of interesting research on how just subtle changes in consumer choice can change people's behavior. And so I think there are some more like subtle ways, conservative ways to resolve the meat paradox, but I think right now it's such a lightning rod issue that confronting it has its pros and its cons. Confronting it directly has its pros and cons.
Yeah, I think you're right, and yeah, I know you don't like silver bullet answers anyway. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's nuanced and it's complex, and these kind of subtle nudges that we can implement, I think, are, yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a really great direction to go in. I mean, one of the other things that you have written about is gene editing for farmed animals, and that's been making. You wrote about it last year, but it's been making the rounds a bit more recently in the last few weeks. I've noticed more content about that coming out. Could you fill us in on what is gene editing and how it might influence or change the future of factory farming?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting and an issue that I think the animal welfare movement has largely ignored. There's a couple of groups who've done a little bit of work on it, but not too much. And so um, the idea is that, using, well, before it was using transgenic editing, which is basically taking a gene from one animal, putting it into another animal. And you might take a trait from one animal and put it into another animal to have that second animal adopt that trait. And it could be anything. It could be to have them grow faster. It could be to have, which is usually detrimental to their welfare. It could have them be able to better tolerate heat, which is something the FDA just approved for 2 specific cattle and their offspring to be sold. You can also, well, sorry, I should step back and say, for a long time, transgenic editing since the 1970s was how animal geneticists, gene edited animals. But now using CRISPR, you can actually go in and just alter the genes of a species. And there are all kinds of interesting ways that animal geneticists are doing this right now. And in some ways, it could further entrench factory farming and further harm animals. And in some ways, it could reduce animal suffering. And so the ways that it could actually help animals is by breeding to, say, take out breeding like hornless calves, because in the dairy industry, usually the horns of calves are removed, usually without anesthesia, which is a very painful procedure. In the pork industry, male pigs are castrated because if they're not, they develop something called boar taint. Like if they're not castrated, then when you raise them, kill them, and cook their meat, it elicits this really horrible smell. So that's why piglets in the pork industry are male piglets are castrated. So scientists are working on creating, a pig that you don't need to castrate. So there are all these ways that it can be used for good or bad. And right now, I think the industry is kind of at a crossroads. Some folks in the industry are saying we need to use this in order to make animals more productive, which is usually a euphemism for making them grow faster. But it can also be a euphemism for making them more disease resistant, which would be really good because about around 20% of livestock die from disease, which means that 20% of animals being raised for food are stuck in factory farms for some period of time and then die, which means so many animals are bred, raised in factory farms, but never even eaten. So if you could raise more animals to be disease resistant, you would have to breed fewer animals and bring fewer animals into the factory farming system in the first place. But the industry is at a big crossroads right now, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years and decades as more companies want to bring gene edited animals to market.
Do you have a sense of how much time, energy, resources are being invested into gene editing versus invested into cultured meat?
I would assume just by the huge numbers, that huge amounts of money that investors are putting into cultured meat, that sector is getting more space. I mean, an animal geneticist I talked to at University of California, Davis, told me that actually the FDA's regulations are so strict when it comes to gene editing farm animals that it's really hobbled her career. She hasn't been able to do a lot of this work. And so there's not that much work being done in the US. I mean, some of it is being done in other countries too, in the EU. I know that there are some teams in Brazil working on projects. But I would guess there's probably more money being put into cultured meat, but that's a guess. I haven't really looked into the financials of the gene editing sector.
Yeah, it's just interesting to wonder, like, how much of our energy are we putting into that versus the other. But yeah, so I guess it would be really, like, if there's one thing that comes to mind for you about like, because you've been working in the space for such a long time, and you've uncovered so many different things, and you've told, throughout your time at Vox, you've told like loads of different stories. Is there like one, and I know you've got a bank of stories already, you're not short of ideas, and you're not short of things to be talking about, but is there one story in particular that you really want to work on, that you think that something that a story or an issue or something that's hidden so expertly within the meat and dairy industry that you would really like to be able to articulately uncover?
Oh, that is a really hard question to pick just one. I'll share just, maybe just a grab bag of things that have been on my mind, or things that I want to get to down the road. I think it's really interesting that a lot of the cell culture meat companies are working on so-called hybrid products. So they might be anywhere from 5 to 70% made of cultured, tissue or fat from an animal, and the rest is plant-based. And they claim that even just having a small percentage of their products be cell-based really improves, whether it's the flavor, the aroma, the texture. So that's something that I'm interested in, and I'm going to start working on soon. I think, one of the pieces that we worked on with Jessica Scott-Reed was about humane washing in the meat, dairy, and egg industries. And I think, that was a long article, and I feel like there's so much to be said on it that it could have been twice as long. So I'd like to write more about that issue, but especially when it comes to fishing and fish products, because that's a bit more of a black box. And just in general, I'd like to cover more of the fishing industry, because even, I could name a lot of the big companies in the meat, dairy, and egg sector, and what they do and some of the issues they've brushed up against, but I don't know much about the fishing industry. So I'd like to look into that more. And also, I'll say insect farming. You mentioned that earlier. There's been a lot of buzz around insect farming, and Lewis Ballard at Open Philanthropy has done some interesting writing on this in his newsletter. But what he found is that a lot of insect farming is actually not going directly into, say, like cricket chips or, like the protein part of someone's plate. A lot of it is being used as animal feed. And so you could imagine also this future where trillions and trillions and trillions of insects are being farmed to then feed chickens and pigs and cows. And that kind of future is slowly starting to happen. Dylan Matthews, my colleague at Vox, also wrote an interesting article about this around a year ago. So off the top of my head, those are some of the things I'm excited to cover in the coming months.
Yeah, those are really interesting ideas. And on the fishing front, I know Ian Urbina, the author of Outlaw Ocean. I don't know if you've read that book or come across his work.
Is that Ian Urbina?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I said his name right, but yeah, I'm familiar with his work. Yeah.
Yeah, he's about to release a podcast that should be coming out soon. It's a really great series of different stories, from what's happening at sea. I find that as well absolutely fascinating, because it's just a completely unknown, we can't even imagine what is happening out there. And it's one of my pet hates when people are talking about plastics and it's all put on the consumer, like, oh, well, we need to make sure we don't have our plastic bags or our plastic bottles, when obviously that's literally a drop in the ocean compared to what the fishing industry is doing. So yeah, that's it would be lovely to see more content about that stuff. And my final question to you, I guess, is, well, you are a consumer of news, and you're a creator of news and articles and stories, and I know that a lot of people find it so difficult to navigate conflicting information, conflicting stuff about what to eat, conflicting stuff about what's happening in the world around us, what's happening on farmed for farmed animals, and like you say, humane washing. We have this picture of a cow out in a field, and that's what we're eating. And how do you navigate the news, or how would you recommend the average consumer of news content to better navigate all this conflicting stuff that's out there?
It's really hard, and I think a lot of journalists are also in a difficult spot where they don't have the time to be able to spend, sometimes even several days, let alone weeks or months, on an article to try to get to the heart of an issue. So with that, I would say read a variety. Don't depend on one outlet, and also try to actively read people you either disagree with or people who know a lot more than you about a certain issue. So in that case, I would say be very omnivorous in what you consume when it comes to media, both whether it's podcasts or YouTube channels or news outlets, and specific writers. So yeah, I think myself, like any other journalist or writer, is going to have things that they're going to look back on and say, oh, like that article I wrote a year ago, I think I got that one thing a little wrong. I could have said this or that, or I should have interviewed one more person to get a different perspective. So I think a lot of journalists are crunched for time. And so for that reason, read a lot of different outlets, read a lot of different perspectives.
Of course, and always start with Vox and Sentient Media, obviously.
Right. And then go from there.
Yeah. Awesome. Kenny, it's been so wonderful to speak to you today. Where should we direct people to follow your work?
Oh, if you go to vox.com/future-perfect, you can see our work there. I'll be even more specific and say vox.com/future-of-meat. So future of meat. If you Google Vox future of meat, that's all of our coverage of factory farming, not only mine, but also so many great freelancers too.
Yeah, it's an awesome section. I recommend people to have a look around there to further their understanding of everything that's going on in this space. Yeah, Kenny, thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.